The sun had barely risen over the red dust horizon when the town of Silver Range gathered in uneasy silence around the gallows, a rough wooden structure that seemed to swallow the morning light with its shadows, and at its center stood a young woman named Ilara Wynne, barefoot, bruised by circumstance more than violence, her torn beige dress fluttering in the cold breeze as if it, too, begged the sheriff for mercy. But Sheriff Colt Ramsey, stern rigid, a man whose law never bent, even when the truth quivered, had declared her guilty of horse theft and aiding an outlaw, a crime she swore she never committed. And though the people whispered doubts, the sheriff ignored them all, raising his voice to the crowd as he announced her execution, for in his eyes the law was a tower built on stone, not compassion. But far beyond the murmurs and judgments stood a man whose presence cut through the air like a thunderclap, a broad-shouldered widowed cowboy named Dane Mercer, a man who had buried a wife and son under the same sun now burning softly behind his silhouette. And though grief lived in him like an echo, it had never hardened him, only sharpened his instinct for recognizing innocence where others saw none. And when his gaze met Ilara's trembling, fear not of death, but of dying unheard, something ancient stirred in him, something fierce and protective. And before the sheriff could drop the final order, Dane stepped forward, boots thudding like warnings across the wooden platform as he lifted his chin and said in a voice that silenced even the wind, "Sheriff, if the only thing standing between this woman and her grave is punishment, then I'll take her place." A declaration so bold, so unthinkable, that even the sheriff's jaw tightened with a tremor of uncertainty. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, others leaning in as if witnessing history. For Dane Mercer wasn't a man known for foolishness. He was a cattleman, a fighter, a survivor, whose name carried weight across miles of prairie, and when he spoke, people listened, even when they pretended they didn't. Then Sheriff Ramsey spat dust in disbelief before replying, "You'd die for a criminal." But Dane didn't flinch, didn't blink, simply answered, "I'd die to stop an injustice," and the sheriff's stare burned with conflict. Because though he prided himself on the law, he couldn't deny the magnitude of Dane's sacrifice nor the shift in the crowd's mood. Some whispered that if Dane believed Ilara innocent, then she might truly be. For he was a man who'd once chased his own brother for cattle rustling rather than shield him from the law. A man whose moral compass pointed true even when the world didn't. Ilara herself stared at him with disbelief, tears forming not from fear but from the sudden arrival of hope she hadn't felt in weeks, since being dragged from her small wagon by deputies who barely listened to her explanation that she'd been traveling alone after losing her mother, taking refuge with a passing caravan that turned out to be outlaws who abandoned her when trouble came, leaving her to face the sheriff's wrath alone. But hope, no matter how small, burns brighter in darkness. And Dane's words lit a spark that spread through the crowd until even the sheriff's deputies shifted uneasily. And Sheriff Ramsey, sensing his authority tremble, barked, "This isn't a marketplace where you trade lives like cattle. Her sentence is final." Yet Dane stepped closer, his voice firm, steady, and unshakable as a mountain ridge. "Then let the law judge both of us. If guilt demands blood, I offer mine, until the truth is proven." And for the first time, the sheriff faltered. Because Dane Mercer, volunteering his own life, was not something he could ignore without looking like a tyrant. And the people knew it, their murmurs now rising louder, more insistent, more doubtful of the sheriff's certainty. And finally, Ramsey swore under his breath, ripped off his gloves, and growled, "Fine then, you both stand trial, again, under the same breath, same hour." And with a motion of his hand, the noose was lowered from Ilara's neck, the rope swaying gently like a relieved exhale. And though the sheriff tried to hide it, he knew he needed this retrial as much as the crowd demanded it. For if Dane was right and the girl was innocent, then the sheriff's name would hang heavier than any rope. So they brought them both to the town square, not into the dark confines of a courthouse, but before witnesses, before the open sky, where truth has no place to run. And Dane spoke first, telling the townsfolk how he'd tracked the outlaw group days earlier after one of them stole cattle from his ranch, and how he'd found their abandoned trail leading exactly where the deputies claimed to have discovered Ilara, meaning she'd been left behind, not participating, not guilty, just at the wrong place at the cruelest time. And when Ilara finally spoke, her voice, the soft, trembling tone of someone unaccustomed to defending themselves against men bigger, louder, and more powerful, she explained how she'd begged the outlaws to let her leave when she realized they were criminals, how they refused and kept her under watch until a gunfight at the ridge sent them fleeing, abandoning her wounded and terrified, only for the sheriff's men to find her moments later and blame her for the crimes committed by those who had used her presence as a shield. And the people listened, not skeptically, but closely, because her story wasn't the speech of a polished liar, but the shaky confession of someone who'd endured hardship quietly for far too long. When Dane added that he'd found discarded Outlaw Gear, proving her story. Gear he'd gathered at sunrise before hearing of her execution. The sheriff's face hardened with painful realization. For the evidence he'd dismissed now stood before him, undeniable, and refusing it would condemn him, not her. Finally, Sheriff Ramsey let out a long breath, defeated, humbled before removing the star pinned to his coat, whispering, "The law doesn't work when the man upholding it stops listening." And he turned to Alara with a slow nod, declaring her free of all charges, and though the crowd erupted in relief, the loudest sound was the quiet sob Alara released as she collapsed into Dane's arms. Not in romance, but in pure human gratitude, knowing this widowed cowboy had saved her life. Not because he wanted reward or glory, but because he couldn't stand to watch another innocent soul buried by the world's cruelty. And Dane, steady as the earth beneath them, simply said, "Everyone deserves someone to stand for them." And with that, the sun rose higher, washing the entire town in gold, as if blessing the moment justice returned to Silver Range. And if you want more stories of courage, sacrifice, and Western grit mortales, where redemption rides in when all hope seems lost, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because your support keeps these powerful stories alive, and there are many more waiting to be told.